It originated as a very small distribution company under the title Exclusive Films. The people concerned then were my grandfather, Enrique Carreras, from Spain, and a man called Will Hammer, or Hines, depending on how you knew him as to whether it was in his private life or he had a sort of theatrical life.
Hammer was my father, surprisingly enough. He was a successful businessman and a failed comedian. He failed because he wasn't really very funny.
Adopting a company name from Hines' stage name, Will Hammer, they made a handful of films such as this musical with American singer Paul Robeson. Prophetically, one of these early films featured Bela Lugosi, star of Hollywood's Dracula.
I joined, we're very close as we sit here today, to being 50 years when I first reported for work as an office boy in Wardour Street. During the period, may I tell you, when doodlebugs were dropping on London at that time. So it was an exciting start. Well, then I had to go off and do national service. By the time I came back, my father had joined the company.
Jimmy Carreras was the most wonderful salesman I have ever met. Full of charm, knew exactly what he wanted, but charmed you out of it if it was not what you wanted.
And he took this small company and increased it in its size and put on a sales force. And Exclusive did actually become quite a small entity within the British film industry at the time of the quota quickies.
To protect domestic film production, Parliament enacted a quota system. Colonel James Carreras helped fill that quota.
But you see, Jimmy Carreras and Mike Carreras never got on. There was a great schism between them.
My father was a businessman, a salesman. He wasn't a filmmaker. I mean, there was no collision, but there was no meeting of the minds either.
Will Hines' son, Tony, alternated production duties with Michael Carreras, although his secret wish was simply to write.
And after the war, Enrique's son, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carreras, came back, and we seemed to get on right. And he said, why didn't I join? And I'd just come out of the Air Force, and I really hadn't anything to do. So we got together, and I joined the firm.
Tony Hines was a better filmmaker than I was. He was, a definitive filmmaker. Tony only lived to make films.
We became quite friendly, which was most unusual, as Tony never became friendly with anybody involved in movies. We became quite friendly.
We very luckily got hold of the rights and were encouraged to make a film by the booking manager of the ABC cinemas, which turned out to be Dick Barton, which was a tremendous successful radio series and really was a national institution. We started to make a series of radio-orientated characters and bringing them to life in the cinemas. From 1948, we actually had a production program of 6 pictures a year, all based on the radio series. And from that, slowly, whatever the company policies were in changing names, but Exclusive segued into Hammer Films.
Bray Studios began as a Thames-side manor house.
And a lot of it was kind of falling apart and, needed repair. And I remember once it was a terrible thunderstorm. Oh, God, the rain came down in sheets, as it can, as you know there. And the roof's leaking, everything's leaking. And Terry Fisher says, carry on, carry on. And there we are, the splash, dunk, going everywhere, but we carried on.
Hammer hired Anthony Nelson Keyes to run the Bray facility. He and a young assistant named Jimmy Sangster both went on to become producers.
I would work for Hammer ever since I came out of the forces, which was when I was about 20. And I worked with them constantly. We'd work from 8:30 to 5:30 on Wednesdays and Fridays and to 6 o'clock on the other 3 days. And they were very strict about breaking up on time.
And as executive producer, used to cut the turkey at Christmas, It was a really small family, permanent unit. Our crew used to, I think probably 3 years was like a minimum engagement when they used to join Hammer in those days. We had the same directors alternating, and the producers were Tony Hines and myself. Certain types of films that he enjoyed making, I didn't, and certain types of films I liked making, he didn't. But The studio only made one film at a time, and that is a tremendous advantage in not only everybody knowing everybody, but everybody knew what the hell they were doing. They were all working on the same film, and the Americans adored this.
Output was limited to second features. Partnership with Robert Lippert secured all-important American distribution, a bit more money, and stock shots from other Lippert pictures. But in the early 50s, there was little to distinguish the company.
They were not even on their way to becoming a cult then.
Hammer flowed with the incoming tide of television by adapting a BBC serial. The X in Experiment emphasized that the story was too horrific for children.
We were off on our way to Tangier, and we were leaving the airport, and Tony Hines raced up in a car, and just before we got on the plane, he put a whole bundle of television scripts in my hand and said, "Read these in Tangier, we want to make a film of them." I said to Tony Hines, "I would like to do this as a documentary, and I'd like to shoot it cinema verite, handheld cameras, all that." And he said, "Okay, do it."
The Creeping Unknown became the American title, as Quatermass had no name recognition outside the United Kingdom.
3 men went into outer space. Only one of them came back. Came back a strange, distorted creature, haunted and possessed by something beyond human understanding.
Lippert sent Brian Donlevy over to play Bernard Quatermass, director of the first British rocket group.
Unlock his mind for me, Briscoe, and find it. I know you can do it. It isn't just I know the strain and tension you've been under, but to stop now when we're so close.
These were stories with a very dynamic hero who was a no-nonsense kind of scientist who let nothing stand in his way, and who was actually kind of ruthless in his way, which was a really interesting protagonist for a picture. Usually the protagonists in pictures, these people were the villains in American pictures.
You've destroyed him like you've destroyed everything else you've touched.
There's no room for personal feelings in science, Judith.
I want to call around the entire area, evacuate all public, get information to check up every movement that's likely to take place inside this radius tonight. Yes, sir?
And it was then that I started to work with John Hollingsworth, who was already the music director of Hammer. When he played the tapes to Tony Hines, who said, "Okay, let's try." And so there I was, suddenly flung into the Quatermass experiment. Very alarming it was, too, the first time round. It was scored, I think, entirely for strings and percussion. It seemed to suit the subject very well.
The special effects fellow that we had, Les Bowie, who did miracles for nothing. Always complaining, always saying, "How can I do this? It's impossible." Always came up with it. And that monster was, in fact, a piece of tripe.
Again, emphasizing the X certificate, Hammer followed with X the Unknown, a thriller about black radioactive ooze from beneath the earth.
There was Tony Hines and Mike Carreras, and we were batting around ideas, and it seemed at the end of a session I'd come up with the most ideas, so Tony Hines said, "Go away and write it." I said, "I'm not a writer, I'm a production manager." And he said, "Well, write it, if we like it, we'll buy it." So I wrote it, and he liked it, and he bought it.
And posters were the great sale. They used to go over with most elaborate artwork posters. And I remember him once telling an executive that we wanted to do a picture about the Yeti. And the man became most interested in what the Yeti would look like. And Jimmy said to him, "We don't know, we haven't caught one yet."
Bernard Robinson's art department transformed the Bray Manor House into a Tibetan temple, while the camera crew shot action scenes on location in the French Pyrenees.
We had what was laughingly called a crash course in skiing. We had 2 days of it, that's all, at the bottom, before all went up and hung on by our teeth.
Forrest Tucker starred with a fellow who became rather linked with Hammer over the years.
They know it was me. Stay here! Wait! Ed, I can hear you! You've got to understand, that isn't Shelley, it isn't anybody! I can hear his voice! It's in your own mind, it's just happened to me too!
A great guy, and a great guy with props. He works out overnight every single prop and thing that he can use, never tells anybody, and it comes out during the scene. So he became known as Props Pete.
We dare you to see the abominable snowman of the Himalayas.
So what we tried desperately to do is we all said we must never, ever see that Yeti. You can see pieces of him, bits, an arm, an eye, of thing, and let people build their own vision of it.
Nigel Neal adapted his BBC sequel, Quatermass 2. Future director Brian Forbes was one of the victims of a mass alien invasion. Only Quatermass suspects the truth, that the synthetic food in a top-secret facility is not for human consumption. But Nigel Neal still felt Don Levy was too harsh, too bullying, too American.
Vincent Broadhead is dead. Dead? I watched him die a few hours ago in that plant. His whole body covered with some kind of corrosive poisoning, eaten away.
Naturally, the director defended his star.
Now, with that sort of a thing, a down-to-earth, prosaic, honest-to-God man like Brian Don Levy was an enormous help.
That pipe has been blocked with human pulp. No, he's
What's he not done, mister?
Yes, what is it? Tell us. Inside those domes are creatures from outside this earth.
Ah, you're mad.
I've seen them. Thousands of tiny creatures that can join together and expand into things 100 feet high.
Quatermass and the Pit, televised in 1958, was planned by Hammer for more than a decade. Ultimately, Andrew Keir took the Quatermass role under the direction of Roy Ward Baker.
Well, I read it and I thought it was absolutely marvellous. It was a really fireproof script. It was excellent. The film was meant to be made at Elstree Studios. And they suddenly said, sorry, we have no space. But just up the road was the old Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer studio. And they were only too delighted because their studio was empty. So we had the whole place to ourselves. So it was very lucky, and an enormous back lot, which we built the exterior of the underground station.
An excavation uncovers a rocket ship of unknown origin and the rotting remains of giant insects. Quatermass deduces that alien technology endowed the human race with intelligence and the will to purge society of anyone who does not follow the will of the hive.
Despite the fact that I didn't get on with Roy and I was a bit tricky with other people, but we gelled as a unit, you know, as a group of actors.
We wanted to kill you. Why? Because you are different.
I thought that some of the scenes were uneven.
It's Barbara. She's the one. My duty now is to quieten public alarm. And you keep your damn paws out of things.
It's still a remarkable picture. It was an idea movie, and that was really unusual.
The film came out the same year as 2001. By then, the name Hammer signified Gothic fantasy. By 1950, the classic fiends had been used as buffoons and comic foils.
In the 50s, when the genre was basically in decline, the horror movies had sunk pretty low. And when the Hammer pictures came along, they were obviously classier.
Max Rosenberg and Milton Subotsky approached Hammer's silent partner with a Frankenstein script.
It didn't bear much relationship to the film that we finally made. They had the ear of Elliot Hyman, I think I'm correct in saying, and Elliot, by this time we were now associated with Elliot, but he, because he didn't know much about it either, thought that was a good idea in making, because there hadn't been a Gothic horror made since the Universal cycle, and certainly not in colour. And so he really sent the script over. Tony looked at it and said, no, we can't do this. It just wasn't good enough.
And I'm given a script, which I didn't really like. It's very boring, and it's a sort of rehash of the old. But anyway, we were going to do it.
A cheap black and white production was planned, with Boris Karloff considered for the role of the old Baron, when Hammer learned they would be sued if they copied any elements from the older films.
So we had to make a film that was entirely different from the first one, but then it became fun.
Instead, they planned an all-new version with Jack Asher shooting in Eastman colour and Jimmy Sangster completely rewriting the script.
I'm not sure. I don't think so. I don't think I read it. I just seen all the old Frankenstein movies. Only problem with Universal was they had a copyright on the monster. We couldn't use the idea of the Boris Karloff type monster with the bolts through his neck. We couldn't do that. That was the only problem. I mean, Frankenstein was public domain. That's why we came up with a different one, different design.
Terence Fisher had directed moody TV episodes of Robin Hood and a thriller admired by Hitchcock himself, So Long at the Fair.
Ah, it was lovely. He was such fun. He always knew exactly what he wanted, and that's why the films were made fast and the way they were.
Quiet, didn't have a lot to say. Knew what he was doing. He was an old-time pro.
Luckily, I had a break in my BBC work and was able to take the role I'd seen Colin Clive play in the original 1931 film.
We've discovered the source of life itself, and we've used it to restore a creature that was dead.
We never make our films with tongue-in-cheek. Having played so many of the period doctors, I always go to my doctor to ask, how do you take a brain now to do anything? But I think that you must do it all correctly.
I can't prove your murder, but I can stop you using his brain.
Why, he has no further use for it?
Don't be a fool! Be careful! You damage it!
A sale to Warner Brothers brought barely enough to finish the film. £40,000, about $112,000. Christopher Lee brought a new interpretation to the role of the man-made man.
The legs are independent of the arms. The hands sort of don't coordinate with the feet or the rest of the body. So I tried to play the character like an ill-coordinated, childish creature.
The first day I met Christopher, he was disappointed that he hadn't any dialogue. I told him, consider yourself lucky. I've read the script.
Oh. Well, we were shooting in the dark. We really were. I did about 3 tests, if I remember right. I think I said, look, it's bits and pieces of other people, so it should be patched together. Makeup man Phil Leakey created a face that's been rightly described as looking like a road accident. A patchwork creature of shards and stitches. It was almost impossible for me to eat or drink, and naturally there weren't many people prepared to sit down and eat and drink with me.
It's never horrific to you. Well, in fact, we might have laughed. I probably did.
I guess I was 10 or 11. Oh, it was terrifying. I mean, I was scared to death. I've always heard the makeup criticized in later years as not being a very good makeup. I thought it was pretty creepy.
What is amazing today to me is the production value, the beauty of the sets, the costumes. They were all real. They were all Victorian costumes.
Elizabeth, come back!
The disembodied hands, eyes and organs were liberally garnished with bright red blood, much to Christopher's dismay when he was shot in the face.
When this happened, I gave vent to the most ear-splitting shriek, which literally paralyzed everybody on the set. I don't think I'd ever had anything like it. And it was genuine, because there's some agent in this blood, glycerine, whatever. I felt somebody had put a red-hot poker into my eye. The film grossed 70 times its production cost, $7 million. The company had, in fact, created a being with a life of its own.
Hammer's made their first remake after the 29 pictures in 1956 or 58, I think it was. And it was the Frankenstein picture, and it was only one amongst 5. There was Up the Junction, I think it was Peter Sellers, and Frankenstein picture, and 2 or 3 others, a Quatermass picture. No idea of starting this incredible snowball.
I remember everyone being astounded at the success of that movie, though. I mean, it took off. And I don't think we got very good reviews, did we?
The critics hated us. I mean, really loathed the film and loathed us. But it started the cycle, and it started Hammer, as it really became known, Hammer Horror. The critical reaction came at the same moment as the cues. I mean, you've got a choice. What are you going to do? You're going to read the newspaper or look at the cues?
the success of Curse of Frankenstein was way out of proportion to what was expected. I think if that picture hadn't been as successful as it was in America, there might not have been any other big Hammer films.
Through his friend Mike Frankovich, James Carreras struck a 3-film pact with Columbia Pictures to include a sequel, originally called Blood of Frankenstein. The script focused on the continuing attempts of Baron Frankenstein to perfect his grisly work.
I wanted to scare people and make them sort of shudder. And I think what is the most shudder-making thing, from my point of view, was cannibalism. So I put cannibalism into the picture.
In the year 1860, I, Baron Frankenstein, was sentenced to death on the guillotine. But I have escaped the guillotine, and I shall avenge the death of my creation.
As Peter and I used to play games on the set all the time, we'd play.
Who is he? Nobody. He isn't born yet.
We had a sheep's brain. The technicians forgot to put the brain in the fridge. And the smell was appalling. All the technicians were fainting.
I think what he's doing is a ruthless thing. It might be different from Mary Shelley, but it wasn't much different from other movie Frankensteins.
There was also an abortive TV pilot film, but it was shot in Hollywood, not by the Hammer production team.
It was just disaster. I mean, the people who were involved, which was Screen Gems, had no idea what they were trying to make. I don't know why they ever came to us in the first place, because, you know, we had made some fairly good Gothic stories. Tony Hines went over to finish the project, and even he couldn't get them to make a good film.
If nothing else, it pointed out how uninspired the first film might have been. Hammer and the Baron went back to work in 1963. A wrestler named Kiwi Kingston played this new monster under the direction of Freddie Francis.
Terry was unwell at that time. I mean, Terry became unwell and then got progressively worse. By this time, Hammer had cleared with Universal that they could use the original makeup. And I thought it needed somebody much more physical than dear old Chris. And our man was physical, but I would have, you know, if we did it again, I would have somebody who could act a little better. And obviously, I usually think of the most effective way visually. Having been a DP, and still am, I always think visually first.
Baron was a bit ahead of his time. I mean, I was transplanting human organs before that clever Dr. Christian Barnard in South Africa in 1968.
You are interrupting my work.
Your work. The work of the devil.
Hands. Please, Father. You can't. No!
Terry Fisher returned in 1967.
The Terence Fisher pictures tend to be shot in long masters, I noticed. So one of the fascinations in those pictures is just to sort of watch him try to do something with essentially an empty frame.
With novice performers like Playboy model Susan Denberg, Terry patiently blocked out the action bit by bit.
Who am I? Who am I?
Frankenstein Created Woman is a very interesting picture. It's got a lot of interesting thematic stuff that you really wouldn't expect, that they didn't have to deal with. In Frankenstein Created Woman in particular, I remember great stills of Peter Cushing and Susan Denberg that weren't in the movie. You know, and I could never figure out whether they were never shot or whether they were cut out or what the story was.
The stills had nothing to do with the story. Hammer just wanted to sell theatre tickets. In 1967, Frankenstein moved to the larger Elstree Studios with Terry Fisher again as director.
Terry would pretty much let you go through the scene. He trusted your own instincts. He was very easy to work for.
You haven't finished.
He would just tell you what you'd be doing previous to this, what your emotions would be likely to be like, and then ask you to run it through.
Right. Action. Scientist. Surgeon. Madman. Murderer.
can transplant his brain. If I don't, it'll die through lack of oxygen.
But that would mean you'd have to remove someone else's brain to do it.
Of course, Carl. However.
Once more into the breach with blackmail, murder, and skullduggery.
But he's only doing it for a frightfully good cause.
I loved Peter. He was very gentle. Everybody loved Peter. He was very gentle. He adored his wife. He was kind.
What a lovely piece of export.
I can't speak too highly of him.
What have you done to him? For God's sake, go away! Leave me alone!
Jimmy Carreras wasn't too keen on horror pictures, and seeing a crew of 50, at least 40 of whom appeared to be doing absolutely nothing, used to make him a bit testy.
Hammer opted for a younger Baron, the late Ralph Bates. Veronica Carlson played the Hazel Court role for Jimmy Sangster, who directed, wrote, and produced.
We had a great sense of humour. At lunchtime, we went into the restaurant, laughed ourselves silly about everything, calmed down, and then Jimmy said, "Now be serious."
I had the most fun ever directing that movie, which is not a good position to be in, writer, producer, and the director, because there's nobody to tell you you're making a mistake.
It's almost like the same saga that the Universal pictures had, where they kept adding more monsters and trying to, make the pictures seem more exciting than they had been previously, and then by the time they'd done the parodies, it was over. It's the same thing that's happened to the Western.
6'7" David Prowse wore a diaper and a bald cap as this monster. David looked far more imposing in black leather years later in Star Wars. As usual, the next film began with a poster, eventually modified. With burned hands useless for surgery, the Baron enlists a young surgeon to help fashion one last abomination. It was the Baron's last hurrah, so far. Because of the period, I was given a wig covered in Marcel waves. I thought it maybe looked rather like Helen Hayes.
I knew you couldn't give up your work completely. And you haven't.
If I succeeded this time, then every sacrifice would have been worthwhile.
Long-time employee Roy Skeggs had risen to producer. Tony Hines wrote the script as John Elder, the composer Jimmy Bernard, and Terence Fisher directing our last film together. David Prowse also played this monster in a mask and hairy rubber suit.
But even if the monster was not state-of-the-art, the Baron was his usual warm and considerate self.
If everything could be reborn, unblemished, if a new version of his true self could be created, in the normal way by mating, but who with? Sarah.
For good or ill, these films brought Technicolor blood to the screen. Without them, we may not have seen The Wild Bunch, Taxi Driver, or even the original MASH.
To Baron Frankenstein, creator of man.
In any case, Hammer breathed new life into the Mary Shelley myth. In return, Frankenstein created Hammer.
They will never be rid of me.
In 1958, Universal Pictures allowed Hammer to remake Dracula in exchange for U.S. distribution rights.
Well, Horror of Dracula was a particularly big moment in my life and the life of a lot of kids my age. We had watched the Universal pictures, and they were scary, but they were on television in your house. So there was something about that was a little safer about watching those pictures. But in a theater with color, I remember kids' parents not letting them go see it because it was supposed to be so scary.
On one side, the power of good.
Castle Dracula, there's somewhere here in Clousenburg. Will you tell me how I get there?
On the other, the seductive allure of evil. Jimmy Sangster's script eliminated the supernatural powers suggested by Bram Stoker, but substituted something even more potent, sex appeal.
I thought the more human he became, the less magic or fantasy figure he became, the more threatening he was.
Slip-on canine fangs became de rigueur for all vampires to come, in Hollywood, Italy, Mexico, France, even Japan. Like Frankenstein, this was a drastic change from previous versions.
You must help me. You must. You're my only hope. You must.
I'll help you. I promise.
I decided to play him as a malevolent hero. I decided to play him as a man of immense dignity, immense strength, immense power, immense brain, because it's all there. He's a kind of a Superman, actually.
Dracula was sexy, and he was seducing people, and he was basically going to bed with women. You know, and afterward they just thought he was great.
Particularly as my dear friend Christopher Lee plays the character of Dracula, the women are very much attracted to him. I mean, that first picture, you had the lady opening her French windows, lying back and waiting for her lover to come.
Well, that was definitely in the screenplay, and I think Terry Fisher, the director, certainly emphasized it. It wasn't a new ingredient. I mean, it's definitely been there. If you look at Nosferatu, and I mean, even in the strangest forms of these films, there's a strong sexual element. But in the color, again, the blood became a little more gory, the sex became a little more cleavage, and the whole thing grew up a little.
It was quite original, I think, making him a very presentable, quite sexually attractive, not to me, but quite sexually attractive actor, instead of this rather florid, puffy-faced gentleman one associated with.
This three-note dropping octave theme underscored the power of the title character.
Taking the title of the movie, is that what you mean? And thinking of a tune that fits it, and the obvious one is Dracula.
I had this date with this guy that I was trying to impress, all of 16, and I'm looking, I'm going,
You loved. It's only a shell, possessed and corrupted by the evil of Dracula.
and I'm grabbing him and I'm doing all of this, and all of a sudden this scene comes in where they put the stake in and I faint. Are you all right? Are you all right? And I'm going, oh God, oh God.
The end of Horror of Dracula was one of the few times that I can remember when I was a kid, people screaming in the theater. Because it was so horrible and so scary.
Dollar for Dollar, the film outperformed Hitchcock's Vertigo, released the same year. Critics castigated the film as revoltingly inferior to the 1931 version. But Jack Asher was hailed for his camera work, and Terry Fisher's status as a filmmaker was assured. In New York for the premiere, we found out just how valuable a product we had created.
James Carreras, Tony Hines, Peter Cushing and I, the four of us went to the office of the president of Universal Films. And he then said, gentlemen, this film of yours will lift Universal out of bankruptcy. Now, I've made a point of asking Peter Cushing and Tony Hines and Jimmy Carreras over the years, did he really say that, or did I imagine it? He said it. Interesting. Brides of Dracula, 1960, featured a sexually ambiguous Baron Meinster who drank the blood of men, women, even his own mother.
You needn't be afraid, she's dead.
It offered strong roles to Martita Hunt and Frida Jackson, again under Terry Fisher's direction, as Dr. Van Helsing continued his zealous crusade against the corrupt cult of vampirism.
Neither the budget nor my sense of the character allowed the original climax. Van Helsing conjuring a horde of bats to destroy the depraved Baron. But a jolly good fight and a splash of holy water and a burning windmill provided a fine alternative. Count Dracula himself returned 8 years after the original 1958 film. John Trevelyan of the British Board of Censors objected to a ritual used to revive the Count from the ashes of the first film, so Hammer toned it down a bit. Instead of cutting the victim's head off, Dracula's disciple tastefully just slits his throat.
I must kill him. He is already dead. He is undead, Mr. Kent. He can be destroyed, but not killed.
Over 3 warm days in May 1965, the brother of Francis Matthews shot these home movies at Bray Studios. Camera angles will hide the fact that the castle is really only 1 story high. There are a great many scenes to shoot, arrivals and departures, and the climax.
Susan Farmer and Barbara Shelley are on their lines. Charles Tingle snoozes. Christopher Lee discusses the action. And Francis Matthews paces out his walk across the castle drawbridge.
The heroes are always boring in those films. They have to be, because the excitement comes from the character roles and the villain. Since you're not going to do anything, it's better you don't say anything either. I wish you could run it again and hear me saying, I must kill him, just after this terrible thing has happened. It's not only the delivery of the line, but the fact that I allowed Terry to let me say the line. My sister-in-law's a vampire, my brother's dead, my wife's nearly been killed, I'm exhausted. There was always a danger with Hammer that they forgot what had happened to you.
Makeup man Roy Ashton inserts hand-painted contact lenses for that wild, bloodshot look. Sometimes with these wretched contact lenses in, I could hardly see at all. I'd lunge for somebody and miss them altogether.
Chris is ready.
Terry was a great arranger. He'd say, show me what you're going to do, and I'll tell you if it's right or wrong. And he always gave editor James Needs exactly what was needed.
First assistant Bert Batt supervises the frozen moat, actually a plaster surface covered in a salt solution. On action, Christopher strides regally, holding his cloak for the proper billowing effect. Later that day, the climax.
Kent, get away from there! It's too late!
Dialogue in the original script was just dreadful. So we compromised. The character remained mute.
Why don't you shoot him?
It will do no good, my dear.
Impervious to bullets, perhaps.
Running water.
But not the pure elements. Whatever the merits of the individual films, the combination of technical expertise, on-screen talent, and showmanship proved that British films could succeed in the world marketplace.
Of the 19 films released by 20th Century Fox in 1966, only 6 were profitable. 2 of those were Hammer, this one, and Rasputin, the Mad Monk. In later films, we could afford stuntmen like Eddie Powell to do the more dangerous scenes, but that's really me, getting a lungful of cold water in the name of art.
Wardrobe mistress Rosemary Burrows cleans off Dracula's shoes and cape, and Christopher Lee slips out of his wet clothes, presumably into a dry martini. But the ice thawed less than 2 years later. You just can't keep the old boy down.
I know that on that one, Terry was definitely not fit, so there was never any question of them asking Terry to do it.
Director Freddie Francis had been an Oscar-winning director of photography, or DP.
Then later, when people like Freddie Francis, who was the DP, started to direct, the pictures would go in for a little bit more gimmicky visuals.
Arthur Grant, he was a great fan of mine when I was a cameraman, and I let him use my filters from The Innocents for that, with the sort of graduating colours coming in from the side.
These amber filters visually indicated an aura of evil.
There is a girl.
Maria?
Bring her to me.
Irresistible to women, unstoppable by men.
Christopher Lee, Veronica Carlson, Hammer's new star discovery, Dracula's most beautiful victim.
Well, I used to skip classes at college to, if I knew there was a new Dracula film out or a new Frankenstein film out, and they were always the Hammer films. I don't think that I thought that I would ever be up there with them, but I yearned to be just that, and I pretended.
They lost a lot of what I'd hoped to get in it. I wanted to accentuate the romantic interest between the boy and the girl, and which I did do in the shooting, but as I say, once we'd finished shooting, the film was put in the mincing machine and wound up. I went away for a week's holiday, and when I came back, they'd finished editing it. The film was probably due out in about another 2 weeks anyway.
Very tall, very aristocratic, beautiful operatic voice. I think he is the epitome of Dracula. It was a dream come true.
The American distributor came up with a silly, effective ad catch line, boy, does he give a hickey.
The big difference that those pictures had at the time from American pictures was they were not just gorier, because the gore, if you look back at them, was actually kind of tame, although at the time it was a little bit more than people were used to, but it's mainly the sex. The parade of buxom British starlets, close-ups, alleged close-ups on medallions that are really, huge buxom shots. These myths have a certain built-in Freudian fascination that never really goes away.
But you're talking about Van Helsing riding a stake in this section. If you like to look at it the way it is, but I don't think that's ever meant. But no, the reason for staking Dracula is to get rid of him.
And they nearly did. To save money, accountant Brian Lawrence suggested a Dracula film in name only. But the American distributor insisted that the title character actually appear. Sir James Carreras pleaded with me, saying that I would throw the entire crew out of work if I didn't appear. So, of course, I accepted. But they now had to fit the character into the script, so I was only required to pop up from the occasional dark corner and do very little else.
No. Secure enough to spoof his image, Christopher Lee appeared in The Magic Christian with Raquel Welch.
And Christopher and I became good friends also at one point when I was living in London. He and his wife Gita, but they were very nice people, and he was quite an elegant and quite a sensual Dracula. I thought that was just an act, and he was quite like Dracula, actually, Christopher.
Within a year, Hammer ground out another sequel.
What I was trying to incorporate is the element of magic, the mystery, the touch of the supernatural. There was one thing that nobody else had ever done, which was when the hero, Jonathan Harkness, I think it is in the book, he looks out of his window and he sees Dracula climb out of a window of the castle. But it had a certain amount of opposition because it was going to cost money to build a special set for this. But at any rate, we did.
But this one barely received American release.
The bloodline was getting thin, so Hammer tried a transfusion in a new vein.
I think it came from a distributor. I think it was partly accepted by us eagerly as a change of scene. It didn't work. It was a mistake.
The late Canadian director Alan Gibson put us all through our paces. Vampirism went mod.
That was the first time, I think, in my short career at that time that I realized that I actually did want to act. This was really it, because I believed in what I was doing.
Something new, yet as old as time.
Come on, Johnny.
A date with the devil.
I was Dracula's disciple. I was 22 and enjoyed it enormously. But he was absolutely the part, you know. You couldn't imagine anyone being better than him or being more impressive than him.
I summoned you! It was my will.
Just his presence alone helped you, you know what I mean?
One bright spot was the return of Peter Cushing as the descendant of Dr. Van Helsing.
He was delightful. He was very tough and very, very fit for a man of his age. And I would do a lot of the stunt with him, you know, and grappling and so on, and he was in very good shape. And he did a lot of his own stunts, I mean, falling off hay wagons and things like that. Extraordinary man.
You could be Dracula's next victim.
Seriously, I am a fully fledged vampire because we had the scene where I had to Christopher Lee sunk his fangs into me, and he actually, he got a little carried away and drew blood. So I am a fully fledged vampire. That is one of my claims to fame, which I have on my resume.
You don't have to act much because he is very frightening when he has all his gear on, his white face and the contact lenses, and he's very tall. I'm not small, and he is very tall. At that moment, I was being bitten by Dracula, and I believed it.
Christopher Lee had major reservations with the story.
I stopped making them in 1972 because, in my opinion, the presentation of the character had deteriorated to such an extent, particularly bringing him into the contemporary day and age, that it really no longer had any meaning.
Nevertheless, when the cameras rolled, we both gave it everything we had. Lee's final Dracula was out to destroy mankind with a deadly virus and deprive himself of human victims. A rather twisted death wish.
Van Helsing, I call upon you to witness my supreme trial.
You are living and yet you are dead, the undead. You cannot die. You must want to.
My lens has spread over centuries and has just begun!
That was one of the few Bram Stoker lines that managed to creep into the scripts. This film finally wound up in America, years after it was made, under a rather generic title.
Count Dracula and his vampire bride.
Other fine actors have since donned the cloak. Frank Langella, Jacques Palance, Louis Jourdain, George Hamilton, and now Gary Oldman. But Hammer's Dracula seems to live eternally in the memories of those who experienced him.
I am Dracula, and I welcome you to my house.
The growing facility at Bray Studios reflected the company's expanding horizons.
And we all lived through the times when the first stage went up. There was never a stage when I went there. And then a second stage went up. The field where we shot Quatermass with the rocket coming down and the tree and all the fire engines, they finally built a stage on that too and everything. So all our stuff there went.
This macabre world peeked over the studio fence.
In those days, the filmmakers still actually knew how to make films and not deals.
We had 6 weeks to make the movies.
Well, one just had to do it in the time that was allotted, and it was never enough.
After we'd been making them a while, I was asked if we could cut down, make them a bit cheaper. I was always being asked that.
The Ready Reckoner, if you've got a Ready Reckoner in your mind, that ticks over, and you know exactly which line to take.
Construction's 85%. Dialogue's not important. The actors are going to change. The actors and the actors are going to change the dialogue anyway.
If an audience thinks about Jimmy's script, then you're dead. But Jimmy used to get them rattling along at such a pace that the audience didn't have time to think about them.
We would bring the films in on budget and on schedule and deliver them. The Americans were really only interested in delivery dates because once they put it on a piece of paper, it was gospel.
If any of us could get any artistic points in, we could. But the whole overall operation was a sort of business financial situation.
Well, I have to say that, yes, they didn't like spending too much money.
I was earning my wages, basically.
I thought the stars were behind the camera more than in front of it.
Tony Hines, who was really the head of production at any rate at Hammer.
He was a very shy man and didn't get involved in films on the floor. He was real behind-the-scenes guy.
Tony was the master at it, and he had Terry there. I mean, why interfere with a winning formula?
Tony would never complain if one altered a little bit here and there.
We did a bit on location and a lot in the studio.
I started with them when they were exclusive films, and they used to send me a script and say, Andrew, what can you do with this? It was like being in rep.
We were all a wonderful team, really.
I was ready, and they buried me up to my neck, and it was getting on for lunchtime. So they said, right, we'll come and shoot the scene after lunch. So there I was, left.
The art direction, of course, was absolutely superb.
Bernard Robinson had an art director for certainly all the original horror films. Very, very clever man in making a lot out of not very much.
They had an excellent team, and they got marvellous sound from this comparatively small orchestra.
We never went over budget or over schedule.
There were many times when I didn't finish a score until maybe the morning of the recording.
And we delivered them, so we delivered the goods.
They made films in all sorts of genres. They made war pictures and, you know, program movies.
We took a few more chances, perhaps, but the structure, the family feeling, the flavor, the units, the directors remained very much the same.
Listen to the themes of James Bernard, and you can hear the syllables of the film's titles.
Technically, the pictures were very good, and Jack Asher's camera work and James Bernard's scores were exceptional. They seem to be doomed to do the same thing and just have to keep repeating themselves over and over.
Bernie Robinson, brilliant. An awful lot of what we got away with, and I can actually say got away with, was due to Bernie. In Yesterday's Enemy, it was the Burma War thing. Bernie did revolving jungles and things. Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was president of the Burma Star Association, sat next to me at the premiere. And during the picture, he said, I know that place. Where did you shoot that? I know that place. I hadn't the heart to say on stage 3 at Shepperton. And then they had a set there, which was a Ruritanian village, which was a standby set they kept the whole time. I have to keep repairing it.
Suitably redressed, this Ruritanian village became Parisian back streets, alleys of Victorian London, or the docks of Hong Kong. For the 1959 remake of The Mummy, Bernard Robinson's art department and construction crew recreated the tombs of ancient Egypt.
It was a very good movie. It looked absolutely wonderful. It looked like a multi-million-dollar film. You know, the real stars of Hammer, in my opinion, were people like Bernard Robinson, the art director.
Pre-production art puzzled me. I saw a poster of the mummy striding through the countryside with a light shining through his body as though he had a car headlamp or something. And I said to Teddy Fisher, we mustn't cheat the audience. Could I take the harpoon in the study and run it right through old Christopher, and he can just break it off and just carry on regardless?
But it did enable me, with movement and with the eyes and the thought in the eyes, to create a character. The movement is terribly important, how you reach out a hand. Now you reach out a hand, is it to take somebody, or is it, because you're desperately seeking help?
Tony didn't think The Mummy was serious enough. I mean, by this time he's now steeped in the true Gothics, and it's quite true, The Mummy is a little bit more colourful and a little bit more adventurous. I liked doing it. In fact, the only horror films I ever personally made were the 2 Mummies, or if not 3, I can't remember. I enjoyed directing, of course, yes. I mean, I don't know anybody who wouldn't enjoy directing.
Kenneth Hyman, son of Hammer's silent partner and later head of Warner Brothers, proposed a Sherlock Holmes series to begin with The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Some revolting sacrificial rite has been performed. What depths a human being can sink to.
What human being could have done this?
That is precisely what I intend to find out.
How can you be so certain that somebody took one of the bishop's spiders and deliberately placed it in Sir Henry's room? That it wasn't in the luggage he brought from South Africa?
Elementary, my dear Watson. There are no tarantulas in South Africa. What do you want me to do? Identify anything I may find. Strange things are to be found on the moor. Like this, for instance.
In fact, after doing The Curse of Frankenstein, the next part I played was the romantic lead, Sir Henry Baskerville, in The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Swine. You thought it was going to be easy, didn't you? Didn't you? You won't be the first of your family who thought that. And you won't be the first to die because of it.
Alas, Holmes did not inspire a string of sequels like Dracula or Frankenstein.
Which way? For heaven's sake, which way?
Playwright Wolf Mankiewicz received double Hammer's usual salary for this Freudian twist on Dr. Jekyll.
For sake, man, don't kill him. Let me alone, Jekyll. Let me alone.
Jekyll.
I deserve nothing better than you.
Desire drove her to deception. Jealousy drove him to madness.
Will we ever know who we really are? Who are you, Kitty? Who are you?
Where's Henry?
Believe me, your husband is here.
But audiences didn't warm to the film, nor to the handsome Mr. Hyde. The picture was a financial failure under several titles.
At that time, we actually were doing, in my opinion, some of the best films we ever made. Tony found The Pony Cart, which I think was a play, and turned it into a very strong film, a warning, never take sweets from a stranger.
That's right. That was the only film I photographed for them, yes, which I thought was a very good film. I think that's the trouble. If you have a sort of trademark like Hammer, you have to keep producing the same films.
The critics never forgave us for being successful, there's no doubt about that. They accused us of really trying to capitalize on the elements of it. It was a very, very wrong criticism. And it was started by a couple of critics who actually never, ever gave a Hammer film of any sort a good critic.
The Damned also lost money at the box office. The financial failure of these experiments convinced James Carreras to stay within the proven formula. It was hard to argue with success. Michael Carreras ordered the backlot transformed for a film about the Inquisition, but the Catholic League of Decency threatened to ban it. Luckily, Jimmy Carreras sold Universal on another movie on the basis of a poster. But Hannah had to absorb the cost of a Guy Endore novel, Werewolf of Paris. With no money left, Tony Hines became a writer out of necessity.
And all I know is I was landed with a set of Spanish sets.
British censors objected to everything. Violent conception of the werewolf child, his sacrilegious birth on Christmas Day, even a nobleman picking a scab from his nose. Hammer argued that the film was less graphic than Hitchcock's Psycho. The censor replied, Terence Fisher is not Alfred Hitchcock.
Oliver Reed was one of the many who got early breaks with Hammer, including Leslie Ann Down, Donald Sutherland and Freddie Jones. Recurring character actors like Michael Ripper, Richard Wordsworth, George Woodbridge and Miles Malleson gave the films the cosy feel of a rep company.
The quality of acting in those pictures was way above what you would usually get in that kind of film. People realized that good actors could indeed find elements in these characters that really brought out some of the drama.
He who robs the graves of Egypt dies.
Professional frustration caused Michael Carreras to leave in 1961.
I mean, I went off and did my thing for a couple of years. I did a musical, which I always wanted to do. I made a Western, which things I would never have been able to do at Hammer.
Executive chores fell to Tony Hines, who handed the producer's reins to Tony Nelson Keyes and later Aida Young, one of the first female producers in England.
I don't think Aida was as dedicated as we were. She, rightly so in a way, her idea was just to get the film through.
It was Tony Hines' unpleasant duty to keep costs down. Jack Asher's painstaking photography took time. Time was money. Other cameramen like Michael Reed and Arthur Grant became regulars. Budgets were stretched to the limit.
I said, there's one way we can make them back to back. That is to say, we do a picture, same car, same sets, and do 2 pictures.
I remember seeing Rasputin, the Mad Monk, and the Reptile, and they were all shot in the same sets, and Dracula, Prince of Darkness, and Plague of the Zombies were all shot in the same sets. So it was sort of like watching the same picture twice.
Cary Grant suggested he'd like to try a horror picture, so Tony Hines reworked Phantom of the Opera, but Grant dropped out. The role was played by Herbert Lom.
Young woman, you must come with me.
More than in any other film, Terry Fisher emphasized the romance and sadness in the story. Because the script was written for Cary Grant, the dirty business was left to a homicidal dwarf. The distributor publicized the film widely as a horror story.
But as anyone knows who has read the Gaston Leroux novel, it is a tragic romance. Missing the point, Time magazine called the Phantom about as dangerous as dear old Grandad dressed up for Halloween. The distributor blamed the failure on Terence Fisher, who did not direct for Hammer for 2 years. The unused climax of Bride of Dracula was revamped, if you'll pardon the expression, by Tony Hines in Kiss of the Vampire. Director Don Sharp proved as adept at Gothic eroticism as Sedent Fisher. Even more so than in Dracula, vampirism is linked to sexual appetites. Richard Matheson, author of The Incredible Shrinking Man, adapted his novel I Am Legend, but the script proved too intense for the censors. Hammer sold it to Robert Lippert, who shot it in Italy with Vincent Price as Last Man on Earth.
But Matheson also adapted a classic Dennis Wheatley novel, retitled by American distributors. They worried that audiences would assume The Devil Rides Out had to be a cowboy movie.
I remember Tony Hines ringing me and saying, Jimmy, you've got to do a very good job on this because I don't think it's working. Anyway, he was quite wrong in his judgment, wasn't he?
The lights. What about the lights? They seem to be dimmer.
Terry Fisher was back as director. And whenever he gave me a close-up, I'd make a point of walking up to him and slipping a $5 into his hand. The crew really believed I'd bribed him for a close-up every time we did it.
There's a light in the hall.
In 1968, Hammer Films received the Queen's Award for Industry for bringing £2.5 million into Britain for 3 consecutive years.
They weren't given the Queen's Award for Industry or whatever for nothing. I mean, they were really making a dent in the American market in a way that I don't think anybody has made since.
The creators of The Avengers brought Hammer a movie idea inspired by a lunchtime joke.
Brian Clemens was sitting there, and Brian suddenly said, I know what happens. He mixes up the potion, he drinks it, and he turns into a woman. Well, we all fell about laughing. It's a very funny idea, but he wasn't laughing. He went home and he wrote the script.
Ralph Bates played one of the title roles, but the company had some difficulty coming up with Dr. Jekyll's better half.
There was some talk about me playing Sister Hyde. I was going to say Dr. Jekyll. And a very fine actress went on to play. There was quite a bit of nudity, and I wasn't that keen on that. David Booth, I think was the name of the agent, said, "Oh, Martine, it's perfect. You've come at the absolute perfect time."
Together, it was a brilliant piece of casting. And she did it very well, too.
But unfortunately, he was pressured. I think everybody was pressured, including Hammer, was being pressured into going into more nudity, you know, to compete with what was going on. And they decided to go even further to full frontal nudity when I got on the set, and I said I did not agree to that, you know. So we had a bit of a contretemps. However, I used all of that sort of nervousness and that sort of rage and anger and stuff to birth myself, really. I mean, when I'm there, I don't know anything about my anatomy, even.
It is I who exist, Dr. Jekyll, not you. It is I who will be rid of you. Rid of you!
Interesting idea, the male to the female, and oh, this could be so great. They could have taken it so much further.
It's Hyde, isn't it? How is your brother?
He hasn't been himself of late.
Years later, when I saw Roy Ward Baker, he said to me, "Martine, I wish we had really gone into the male-female."
And that they did. As the 1970s progressed, the new formula became a little more blood and a lot more flesh. Victorian costumes lent themselves to fascinating visuals. And as early as 1959, Hammer added nudity, The Man Who Could Cheat Death.
Which is a remake of The Man in Half Moon Street. Anton Diffring was one of the premier actors of the Berlin Theatre.
I've been taking this fluid every 6 hours now. It's madness. It is what keeps me alive.
It was very necessary. It was in very good taste. But England at that time would have no nudity. So there was a version which they paid me extra for Europe. And it was very beautifully done.
It was beautifully done. Exploitation.
I think Hammer films were exploitation films. I mean, exploitation films basically are films that are designed to exploit via advertising a particular sensational aspect. And if you ever look at the British ads for Hammer films, they are incredibly tasteless. I mean, they really make the pictures look like AIP pictures from the 50s, whereas the American ads tend to be models of restraint, actually, in comparison.
Unlike actors, actresses were often used as window dressing, rarely appearing in more than 2 or 3 films for the company.
I'd been doing a poster for an English campaign called Lamb's Navy Rum. And apparently he used to see this big hoarding or this big poster every day. Supposedly, he said, find that girl and bring her in. And then I was put under contract for a year, which is wonderful. But no duties, no official duties.
I had a photograph on the front page of one of the tabloid papers in England one Sunday, and Jimmy Carrera saw it and said, I'd like that girl for my next Hammer film. He would take care of you. He was a fatherly type figure, and he had everyone's respect.
Outside producers approached Hammer with the Victorian Ghost Story by Sheridan Le Fanu.
Harry Fine and Michael Stile came to me and asked me to do it. And it's very easy to make lunatics or vicars or indeed lesbians or homosexuals of various kinds, to make them figures of fun. To me, that is fatal. I think that's, it's downright rude and vulgar, apart from anything else.
Co-production funds came from Hammer's opposite number in Hollywood, American International Pictures.
I had a certain amount of criticism while I was making it, that it wasn't going to be juicy enough, you know, and all that.
Ingrid Pitt proved as enticing to co-star Ferdy Mayne as to the camera.
We knew each other. We'd met in Salzburg and worked there together. I won't forget that one. She used rather provocative language in between takes, and it was rather delicious to be bitten by her.
In The Vampire Lovers, for instance, somebody throws a dagger at Ingrid Pitt, and the dagger goes straight through her, and she just disappears. It's a romantic view, an essential element in horror pictures, which has been almost, well, now totally lost.
I hope to become known as an extremely good actress, and I hope to get an Oscar sometime.
With Jutta Stensgaard, I don't mean to demean her talent in any way. I think she's very talented and did a lovely job. Her claim to fame was a toothpaste commercial, and very, very well endowed, and also, which helped, I'm sure.
Doubly endowed were Mary and Madeline Collinson, Playboy's first twin centerfolds, stars of the third spin-off.
The devil has sent me, twins of evil.
The Camilla character was reduced to a bit part.
They kept doing the same things to death. I mean, it was like a big thrill to have a lesbian vampire movie, which is turned out to not be something that people particularly wanted to see anyway.
Sometimes the sex was worse than arbitrary. A rape scene in Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, ironically, was later cut as unnecessary.
That was a big disappointment to me, and it was to Peter as well. We talked about that a lot. We were not very comfortable about it because we'd almost completed the whole film. There was no reason. I had no reaction to Frankenstein as if he'd raped me, even though the scene was put in the film much earlier. That was a very difficult thing for me to do. And it was difficult for Terry, too. He was very sensitive about it. And in the end, he just said, enough is enough. And he cut the cameras. He just didn't want to continue it.
Female fiends never found the audience of the male monsters. Actresses fared better with the non-fantasy thrillers. Susan Strasberg in Taste of Fear, Bette Davis in The Nanny, Tallulah Bankhead in Fanatic. Working again with Kenny Hyman, Michael Carreras found an interesting mix of fantasy and flesh.
I was called on the telephone by Dick Zanuck, who was head of the studio then. He said, we've got this fabulous project for you, Raquel. It's called 1 Million Years BC, and it's a remake of a Victor Mature, Carol Landis movie. And I said, oh my God, not a dinosaur movie. Man, I'll never live this one down. I figured, well, Steve McQueen got away with The Blob. You know, maybe I can get away with 1 Million Years BC. You know, nobody will remember this thing. I can shove it under the carpet, you know. But people remembered it. For the kind of films that Hammer makes, I thought that they always do a very good job. They have a certain budget. They have a certain look they're trying to achieve. It's not Gone with the Wind. It's not a David Lean movie, relatively speaking. I thought it was a pretty well-done movie. Ray Harryhausen, who was a kind of genius of sorts to do all of these the special effects and his frame-by-frame photography, and it was all explained to me, you know, in great detail.
So I took on the project with the Hammer Company in London. It was a pleasure to get back to dinosaurs again. They were my first love.
The man was a genius. The frightening thing, of course, is that when you're looking at the rushes, after a full day's work, you go into the theatre the next day, you've got 6 frames. You know, I mean, it's better to hold them up to the light, because otherwise they've gone through so quickly.
Carl Toms really made the most of this little doeskin number that I was supposed to wear. So this costume got smaller and smaller as the production went on. I felt a little self-conscious with this very brief thing on all the time. Alternately, I would try to sort of strut my stuff to make the most of it, because I figured, obviously, this is why they've cast me in this movie, not for my acting ability, because I have no lines.
I think if cave women in the early days looked like Raquel Welch, why, we've regressed considerably today.
When you were doing it, it just seemed so ridiculously silly. You felt like a fool, quite frankly.
Jamaican-born Martine Beswick writhed her way through her portrayal of the naughty Neanderthal.
What was happening was that Raquel had this lovely, everything was like perfect, and mine looked like a rag, you know, so I was a bit jealous. She had more makeup and she had eyelashes, and I had to go like a pig woman. And then you have this big girl fight in the middle. The queen of the shell people and the queen of the rock people had to have a girl fight. And we had to do destry rides again in the caves of Tenerife. The whole thing was kind of like a dance. Martine and I worked out this whole routine together. I just loved to do the action stuff. I should have been a boy.
We often wonder whether the attraction of Miss Welsh or the dinosaurs were the important thing in the picture.
It started me off. So I guess Dick Zanuck was right, you know.
We had some sets standing from Million Years BC. The idea came on to make a quickie.
And he said, Martine, I've got something. He said, I want you to be my queen. I said, oh, all right, darling. What? Well, I want to do this film called
Slave Women of the White Rhino. I mean, what else can I say?
You've got to be kidding.
Why did you come?
I can only believe the fates brought me here.
And they brought you to me.
And all the little blondies had these, they just came right out of acting school. And everybody had these, like, really English voices like this, you know, and it was hysterical.
I am queen here. I will not be denied.
Bosco Holder, Geoffrey Holder's brother. And he did all the dance scenes. I sort of was let loose after he choreographed it. I thought, listen, this is my vehicle. I get to have eyelashes in this one, and I get to have my costume fit. I'm going to make this work. No matter what it is.
We made a huge mistake on that film because we really should have had those wonderful cartoon biff, bang, ouch. It should have been done like that.
Who are you?
Val Guest directed the third saga, created in Sir James' typical manner.
Do me a picture with dinosaurs and a dinosaur with a girl in his mouth. They did this enormous great poster with sex and bikinis and this great thing. And Jimmy said, fine, okay. So he sent that to America and said, what about a picture? Here's the poster. And they set up the picture on the poster.
The dinosaurs were created by American Jim Danforth on the usual sparse budget.
He was a brilliant little guy because he used to work out all those monsters with little human traits to them, which I have never seen done before.
Sir James confirms with accountant Brian Lawrence. Later they head the company with Royce Skeggs and producer Aida Young.
They've got a very good face. Isn't it exciting to find somebody new and launch them each time, like these
find
girls?
somebody that looks like this,
Yes.
I agree. She has to have a special kind of magnetism. I can't describe it, but I know it when I see it. And Victoria Vetri has it, I'm sure.
That was a fait accompli, yes. That came over. She had been a centerfold in Playboy or something, and whoever was doing it, I don't know who the picture was done for over there. It was AIP or whoever it was. Was it Warner's? Right. So Warner said, well, give us some glamour that we know.
Although there is a more final judge than me, and that's the audience when they see Victoria Vetri for the first time.
But lightning didn't strike twice. The distributor didn't push the film widely, nor did audiences take Victoria Vetri to heart as they did Raquel Welch. Danforth and Les Bowie received an Oscar nomination for their effects, but lost to the Disney musical Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
When dinosaurs ruled the earth.
It's over? Yes, sir. It's all over.
As early as 1958, Eros films mimicked the Quatermass style with the Trollenberg Terror. They also produced a Technicolor chiller with a script credited to Jimmy Frankenstein Sangster.
Sickening, isn't it?
No longer could there be this indirection and not showing things and people, you know, describing things that had happened as opposed to seeing them. The pictures were very graphic.
Made in Hollywood by Herman Cohen within months of Curse of Frankenstein, this film referred to the doctor's ancestral home in England. Crates in his lab were even stenciled with the address 113 Wardour Street, London.
Well, that's because Herman Cohen's office was on Wardour Street, in the same building as the Hammer Films office.
Hammer's use of colour and period decor begat the Edgar Allan Poe films in Hollywood. Hazel Court became a familiar sight in these American international pictures.
Your hands are so cold. Oh, I don't think there's really any difference. You just have better facilities here instead of a house, that leaks.
We often found ourselves employed by competitors like the partnership of Rosenberg and Subotsky, who suggested Frankenstein to Hammer back in 1956.
During the 60s, there were a lot of imitators of Hammer. The Amicus pictures looked virtually the same, had identical casts, and I think the studio started to lose its identity a little bit.
Hollywood began spending millions on films we'd done for nearly nothing. Great stars, elaborate effects, and on the low-budget end, violence we'd used as punctuation became the raison d'etre. Nothing succeeds like excess. The face of Hammer changed. Tired of making quality films on diminishing budgets, Tony Hines retired at 46, though he continued to write scripts. Sir James used all his sales ability to lure his son back to the fold.
Money. I needed the dosh. I cleared my brain and came back and got on with the job.
Michael Carreras arranged a co-production with the Run Run Shaw studio in Hong Kong.
It seemed to me that if we were going to go back and make another Dracula type, that we really ought to try and find a new way of telling the tale. So the Shaws, who I've always admired anyhow in their attitude to filmmaking, it seemed to me a natural marriage.
The idea of going to Hong Kong to make a picture, of course, was wonderful if you've never been to Hong Kong. But the difficulties were absolutely enormous. Trying to put kung fu with straightforward horror didn't work, or at least we didn't have a script that made it work.
Christopher Lee declined this final indignity. Instead, the Count was played by John Forbes Robertson. At least I had the honour of driving one final wooden stake.
As the seven brothers and their one sister meet Dracula.
They had their own venue, their own way of doing things, and then suddenly, because everybody was doing nudity and because it was attracting more, well, it's happening again right now. The same thing's happening now,
Knighted and respected, Sir James wished to retire and sell off the company. Michael wanted to keep it in family hands.
I think Jimmy was bought out, or rather, Mike got controlling interest.
Our horror stories by that time were passé. They were children's stuff. You get into chainsaw massacres and what have you. I suppose I wasn't in tune. I have to take the blame for this. I was in charge.
And Mike swears that Jimmy went round the industry and said, "Don't help my son." That's Mike's end of it. Jimmy, on the other hand, I wouldn't put that anything past him, but Jimmy, on the other hand, with that wide-eyed face, say, "I wish him all the luck in the world."
Everything is born, it flowers, and then it fades away, and eventually it dies.
The Hammer period was like the last gasp of world cinema.
And as it happened, the horror thing can't go on forever. Sadly, some of the other streams that I tried to instill into the company's product line just didn't work.
No, it was none of the old gang. We saw this disintegration happening. We were rather sad for it. Because the people who were concerned with Hammer, really, other than Mike, were no longer around him.
The novelty of colour was now standard even on television. Concepts often seemed strained.
It's commonly supposed that a vampire attacks in only one way, by biting the neck and draining the victim of blood. The girls you spoke of, they were not drained of blood, but of youth, of life itself.
Hammer and Brian Clemens tried a swashbuckling vampire slayer.
They wanted they wanted it to appear nude. So we kind of came to a compromise, insofar as my hair was a lot longer in those days. And so that covered my upper chest. and I think I actually used some sort of gaffer tape or something to stick it down. So I felt quite secure in that sense. And then a pair of flesh colour knickers, briefs. And I was all right. I was all set. So it was like being on the beach, really.
Her life will be yours. Yours. Her youth will pulse through your veins, my darling, replenishing, restoring. Take her.
At your service, sir. To the death. Yes, you bleed, my lord. This is God's blade. Forged for your black heart.
But lack of audience response killed Captain Kronos as a potential series.
Possibly it was too romantic. Maybe it was either ahead of its time or you know, the other way. Maybe it kind of lost in time. I'm not too sure. The timing was wrong anyway, I think.
The Lady Vanishes received scant distribution. A Loch Ness movie drowned in a sea of delay. Hammer's last theatrical venture was made in 1975.
98% of so-called Satanists are nothing but pathetic freaks who get their kicks out of dancing naked in freezing churchyards.
I have a feeling I'm dealing with the other 2%.
Richard Widmark challenges Christopher Lee for the soul of a girl named Catherine.
Te adoro et te invoco. They got Catherine. We've got to get her back before it's too late.
By then, a so-called low budget meant £500,000 over $1 million. Hammer brought in German co-financing and an American star, Richard Widmark. And appropriately, Christopher Lee was the heavy.
When this ceremony has been performed, I shall destroy you, John Burney. The demons hate you, Raynor. They're waiting for you. Catherine. Catherine. It's me, Bound!
Michael Carreras left in 1979. Since then, Roy Skeggs helmed the company through the doldrums of the British film industry by producing 2 TV suspense series.
I get asked time and time again in letters and interviews and things, when is Hammer going to return, or will Hammer return?
It's a shame. I think someone should really pick up the torch and run with it.
Entertainment technology has changed radically since the 1950s, yet Hammer thrives, inspiring a nostalgic cult that reaches round the world.
They've often said, we grew up with you. You were like part of the family. We'd go on a Saturday and see these horror films and scream and yell. So we've always considered you part of us, which is wonderful.
Fan periodicals like Little Shop of Horrors, published by Richard Clemenson, savour the films like fine old wines.
Top professionals tipped their hats to Bray.
Gremlins patterned its climax on the end of Hammer's original Dracula. Director Joe Dante cast Christopher Lee himself in Gremlins 2.
He said, but you have to remember, Christopher, that I and all my peers and all my colleagues, and there's a great many of them, Martin Scorsese, Brian De Palma, John Landis, Steven Spielberg, Joe Dante, and many, many others that don't come to mind at the moment. He said, we were brought up on your films when we were teenagers and young men. We were brought up on your films. We liked them, we loved them. And I'm naturally very grateful for that. It means they don't forget.
They were made by people who cared.
While we were doing them, we were dedicated to them.
As a matter of fact, as it worked out, it couldn't be better.
Those films will last forever.
Mocked and vilified in their time, these films are now revered. The world has finally come round to know what we've really known all along. Anything made by Hammer is the best.
I never thought it was going to be anything. And here it is. I know they're showing them at the Museum of Contemporary Art and the Lincoln Center, all those horror films.
It's in our blood. Film is in our blood.
Fun days.
Hammer, one of the happiest studios I've ever worked in my life. It was a family.
These motion pictures created an insular fantasy world with fiery images of love and innocence, of dark sexuality and hideous death.
We who created that world have a touch of immortality through them, and you who share that world over the years can revisit it as you would recall a favorite fairy tale, secure that in the end, good will always triumph over evil.
That is, until the next sequel.